Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. 2 years ago, this committee held a hearing to examine a defense contractor that was charging outrageous prices to our military on mission-critical spare parts for aircraft. Democrats and Republicans came together to demand that the company, called TransDigm, repay the excess profits. I was pleased that following the hearing, TransDigm paid back the money, but TransDigm did not change its behavior. I called this hearing today because the Defense Department's Inspector General recently released a report showing that TransDigm is back at it again. This new IG report reviewed contracts for more than 100 spare parts and found that TransDigm received $20.8 million in excess profit. TransDigm's excess profit margins on individual parts range from 2.8% to a whopping 3,850%. No company should be making over a $3,000 profit from American taxpayers. Yet the IG found that TransDigm's business model is specifically designed to raise prices on defense contracts. TransDigm identifies companies with specialized sole source contracts, buys those companies, and then hikes prices on mission critical parts. Our message to TransDigm today is simple: pay back the money. Let me give you one shocking example. TransDigm manufactures a product called the linear actuating cap, which is used in the F-15 and the C-135 transport aircraft. According to TransDigm, the part only costs $189 to make, but the company charged the Defense Department over $7,000. The IG found that TransDigm repeatedly refused to provide cost data that DoD contracting officers asked for, even when it was needed to determine if the price being offered was fair and reasonable. TransDigm forced contracting officers to choose between accepting prices that were blatantly unfair to taxpayers or denying our military the parts it needs to protect our national security. The last time TransDigm, at our last hearing, at the same time TransDigm is gouging our war fighters, its executives are being rewarded with jaw-dropping compensation. In 2020, TransDigm's founder and executive chairman, Nicholas Howley, received more than $68 million in salary. It would take the average American family around 1,000 years to earn as much as TransDigm's chairman earned in 1 year while overcharging our military. Today, TransDigm is going to tell us that they did nothing illegal or wrong. I disagree. Overcharging taxpayers, even if you get away with it under the law, is just plain wrong. TransDigm will claim that the IG used a flawed methodology to calculate excess profit. This is simply not true. The IG determined that profit above 15% was excessive based on information TransDigm provided. According to TransDigm, similar aerospace industry contractors generally have profits ranging from 8% to 22%. The IG selected 15% for its analysis, the middle of that range. What's more, the nearly $21 million in excess profit the IG identified was based on a sample of only 3% of TransDigm's defense contracts. So the total amount of overcharging may be far higher. TransDigm wants to deflect responsibility, but we are here today saying enough is enough. Congress must act to empower contracting officers when they are negotiating with greedy contractors like TransDigm. Today, I am releasing a discussion draft bill that would require companies to provide cost information when necessary to determine if proposed prices are unfair and unreasonable. This will enable government contracting officers to ensure the government is paying a fair price. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to work with me on this reform. Mr. Howley and Mr. Sine, the last time you both testified before this committee in 2019, you were evasive and refused to provide clear answers to many questions. We expect you to answer our questions today and take responsibility for your company's actions. Most importantly, we expect TransDigm to pay back the outrageous profit it received at the expense of our warfighters and American taxpayers. Thank you to all of the witnesses testifying today. I am appreciative to Deputy IG Hull for the excellent work of her office. I want to acknowledge Mr. Tenaglia from the Defense Department. I understand the department's typical practice is not to testify on the same panel as private sector witnesses. And I appreciate you making an exception for this hearing so that we can have the benefit of your perspective, especially given that DOD also participated in the committee's earlier hearing on this issue. Finally, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a statement Senator Chuck Grassley submitted for today's hearing. Senator Grassley has been a leader in combating government waste, and his letter highlights the need for Congress and DOD to address what he calls, and I quote, egregious price gouging by TransDigm and its subsidiaries. Senator Grassley concludes by saying, and I quote, we cannot keep shoveling money into a fire, watching as it happens, and pretending that everything is fine. Our tax dollars should go towards supporting the warfighter, not paying thousands of dollars for a simple spare part that costs peanuts to make, end quote. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Comer, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney, and thank you to all the witnesses appearing virtually today. We are again here today to do what committee Democrats do best, ignore the failures of the Biden administration. This committee steadfastly refuses to conduct meaningful oversight of the Biden administration. Last week, myself and Whip Steve Scalise sent a letter to Chairwoman Maloney and Chairman Clyburn requesting a hearing into serious issues, including the surge in Omicron, the lack of available testing, President Biden's declining a plan to order millions of tests, political influence at the CDC and FDA, CDC messaging failures, and President Biden abandoning his national plan. I don't need to remind my colleagues that more Americans have now died under President Biden than President Trump. These issues don't even touch on the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, the origins of COVID-19, or the devastating inflation felt nationwide because of Democrats' out of control spending. Instead of focusing on any of these crises, we're here today to conduct a hearing that already happened. We had this exact same hearing in 2019, not a similar hearing, the exact same one with almost the exact same witnesses. Now, I know the chairwoman is a big fan of recycling, but recycling hearings is new to me. I agree the government needs to be a good steward of taxpayer dollars. And I agree Department of Defense should not be forced to pay exorbitant prices. I do not agree with attacking one company that frankly followed the law. The Inspector General concluded as much. I can't remember a company that got hauled in front of Congress for following the law, and certainly not twice. Further, I have serious concerns over the methodology of the report presented today. Primarily, the arbitrary 15% profit ceiling designed by the Inspector General. The IG admits a regulatory or legal profit ceiling does not apply to any of the contracts analyzed in this report. The IG says 15% should not be a benchmark for negotiating fixed price contracts. And the IG does not advocate for a 15% profit ceiling for fixed price contracts. Yet that's the standard they determined applied to TransDigm. That's the definition of arbitrary. We operate in a free market economy. Profit ceilings are inherently un-American. This report does highlight DoD struggles with inventory management. So many of these contracts with TransDigm are low quality and low value, low quantity and low value. For some parts, there are even multiple orders for the same part in 1 year. This is inefficient and undoubtedly leads to higher prices. DoD is the largest purchaser in the US and has massive buying power. It can exercise it to avoid some of the issues we see here today. It can consolidate orders to ensure it's negotiating prices once instead of 4 or 5 times per year. It can better leverage IT systems to forecast demand signals to know how many parts it needs to purchase. And it can hold more parts in inventory to ensure that there's not a last-minute scramble to order more. All of these changes would be good for the taxpayer and for the warfighter. These are changes we should be focused on, making the government more efficient. What we should not discuss today is placing more burdens on businesses, especially American businesses. Because of the Biden economy, there are worker shortages in every sector. Prices are skyrocketing. The last thing needed is more burden and more regulation. If there are common sense reforms that can benefit the taxpayer and not unnecessarily burden business or slow down the procurement, we're happy to discuss them. I hope this hearing will be productive and include questions about how DoD can improve some of these problems. I also hope my colleagues will not resort to shaming one company for what is a systemic issue. There are major issues facing Americans right now. We should be focused on driving down prices, increasing access to COVID tests, therapeutics, and treatments, and holding the Biden administration accountable for a series of failures, not disparaging one company. And I thank you and yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his statement, and would like to remind him and other members of the committee that the subcommittee on the coronavirus is having a hearing tomorrow on Omicron. We had one on it and the crisis last weekend and last week, and we can submit for the record a listing of all the hearings we've had on the coronavirus and the reports that we have issued. Also on Afghanistan, we have held a briefing with the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan. We held a classified briefing at the request of the minority with the Defense Department, State Department, DHS, and the intelligence community. And we had one in the National Subcommittee with Chairman Lynch in December. If you'd like another one, requested, and we will have another one on Afghanistan. And in terms of the hearing today, we have to take steps to make sure that this abuse does not continue. The Department of Defense and the IG has come forward and said that roughly $21 million was overcharged by TransDigm, and that when they ask them for fair pricing and for cost transparency, they're not able to achieve it. I have sent you a copy of a letter and also a bill that we have drafted for your review called the Fair Pricing with Cost Transparency Act, which has been written specifically to address this problem of overcharging the warfighter, the Defense Department, and the American taxpayer. That's just an example of one of the areas that we're responding, that we hope the minority will join us in solving this challenge we have. Now I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness today is Teresa Hall, who is the Deputy Inspector General at the Department of Defense. We will hear from John Naglia, who is the Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisition and the Principal Director of Defense Pricing and Contracting at the Department of Defense. Next, we will hear from Nicholas Hawley, who is the founder and executive chairman of TransDigm. Finally, we will hear from Kevin Stein, who is the CEO of TransDigm. The witnesses will be unmuted so that we can swear them in. Please raise your right hands. Swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help you God.
I swear.
Okay. Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you. And without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. With that, Ms. Hull, you are now recognized for your testimony.
Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Comer, and members of the committee,
Thank you for inviting me to discuss our report on the TransDigm business model and its impact on spare parts pricing. I am Teresa Hull, a Deputy Inspector General at the DoD OIG. I will discuss our long-standing concerns about sole source procurements, such as those the DoD conducts with TransDigm. While these concerns are not new, the prices charged by TransDigm provide another clear demonstration of the ongoing problems with negotiating sole source contracts. Our recent audit examined prices that TransDigm charged the DoD for a sample of 107 spare parts. The issues raised in this audit are not limited to just this company and its contracts with the DoD. Sole source contractors' unwillingness to share cost data, and DoD contracting officers' limited success in negotiating prices for sole source parts are common findings that we have highlighted for more than 20 years. Our reports have identified the lack of cost data available to DoD contracting officers as the root cause for contractors obtaining excessive profits on sole source parts. Using certified or uncertified cost data to perform cost analysis are the most reliable ways DoD contracting officers can determine whether a price is fair and reasonable. The Federal Acquisition Regulation states that certified cost data is required for contracting officers to award contracts above a certain dollar threshold, which is established by the Truth in Negotiations Act, or TINA. The 2018 National Defense Authorization Act raised the threshold from $750,000 to $2 million. Although the intent of raising the threshold was to streamline the acquisition process, the increase in the threshold resulted in contracting officers having less information to use during their negotiations with contractors. This had a particularly large impact on negotiations for sole source items. TransDigm identified that it was the sole manufacturer for 94 of the 107 spare parts we reviewed. Contractors are required to provide certified cost or pricing data only for contracts valued at or above the TINA threshold. From January of 2017 to June of 2019, more than 95% of the contracts that the DoD awarded to TransDigm were below the TINA threshold. TransDigm also practices what it calls market-based pricing. According to TransDigm, market-based pricing is a strategy in which a company sets prices of items that it sells based on what customers are willing to pay for the item, as opposed to basing prices on the cost to make the spare parts. Often with sole source parts, the price charged by contractors becomes what the contractor is willing to negotiate and what the DoD is willing to pay for a part to keep an essential weapons system operational. For our audit, we reviewed 107 spare parts that TransDigm operating units sold to the DoD on 153 contracts with a total value of $38.3 million. Of those 107 spare parts, we found only 2 instances in which TransDigm received a profit of 15% or less. Using 15%, we determined that TransDigm earned $20.8 million in excess profit on 105 spare parts. Our work in spare parts pricing demonstrates that change is necessary to address the high prices charged by and the excessive profits obtained by contractors like TransDigm that sell sole source parts to the DoD. Because policies do not compel contractors to provide uncertified cost data for contracts below the TINA threshold when requested, contracting officers are not always able to use cost analysis to determine fair and reasonable prices for sole source spare parts. To correct the deficiencies detailed in our TransDigm report, we recommended several actions to DoD. However, these efforts will likely have minimal impact without fundamental regulatory and statutory changes. Without legislative changes, the DoD will continue to be unable to perform adequate price reasonableness determinations, and the other price analysis methods are not always effective in identifying excessive prices. Therefore, we support the legislative reforms proposed by the DoD. Without these steps, we believe that the DoD will continue to pay excessive prices for spare parts that it needs. Thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Tenaglia, you are now recognized for your testimony.
Thank you. Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Comer, and distinguished members of the Committee on Oversight and Reform, thank you for inviting me to testify today to address DoD's ability to award contracts for military spare parts at reasonable prices. I very much appreciate the work of Ms. Hull and the Inspector General in identifying policy gaps that hinder DoD contracting officers from obtaining the information they need to establish fair and reasonable prices for items they procure for the warfighter. I thank this committee for continuing its inquiry into this matter and following up on your 2019 hearing. I am John Tenaglia, the Principal Director of Defense Pricing and Contracting and the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. I began my civil service career with the department in 2008 after retiring from the United States Air Force. As the Principal Director, Defense Pricing and Contracting, I am privileged to serve as the functional leader of DoD's contracting and pricing community, and I proudly represent those outstanding professionals today. DoD's contracting officers seek to award contracts at prices that are fair and reasonable. That is, fair and reasonable to the U.S. taxpayer, fair and reasonable to the Department of Defense, and yes, fair and reasonable to the companies that we deal with. Ideally, contract pricing is based on competitive market pressures that dictate the boundaries of what is fair and reasonable. In procurement of military spare parts, though, we don't always enjoy the benefit of competitive market forces. On a positive note, the Defense Logistics Agency was successful in awarding 93% of its contracting actions and 77% of its obligated contract dollars through competitive procedures last year. This includes, but is not limited to, the procurement of consumable spare parts that the military departments need to sustain their fielded weapon systems. However, the department has significant concerns about our contracting officers' ability to obtain data that is necessary to negotiate fair and reasonable prices, particularly for sole source items that are asserted by companies as commercial. As noted in their report, the IG was able to obtain uncertified cost data from TransDigm for nearly all the contracts they examined in their sample. TransDigm declined, however, to provide the same cost data to our contracting officers to support negotiations. The DoD IG's audit report concluded, and I quote, "Without the necessary legislative changes, the DoD will continue to be unable to perform adequate price reasonableness determinations because contractors are not compelled to provide uncertified cost data." I agree with that conclusion. That is why the department submitted the legislative proposals that Ms. Hull just mentioned. Armed with relevant supporting factual data, our contracting officers will negotiate better prices. However, I must clarify, even where we have obtained data such as uncertified cost information, our contracting officers will continue to face challenges where they lack negotiation leverage with sole source contractors who refuse to yield. In my view, there are two overarching issues here. The first, change is needed for contracting officers to obtain the data to analyze and negotiate fair and reasonable prices. The second, though, relates to the business model that the IG's report describes, and whether the law should provide a check against the government paying higher prices for contractors to cover their expenses to acquire companies in the supply chain, particularly where the business model precludes effective competition. If unchecked, these expenses will continue to be embedded in contract prices the taxpayers pay for the products that the warfighter must have to perform the mission. The price we pay matters because the more we pay, the less combat capability we can acquire for a ready force. Since your 2019 hearing on this subject, the DoD has taken action to address these issues and more generally to address commercial item pricing. I've detailed those actions in my formal written statement. The Defense Logistics Agency has continued to pursue reverse engineering to create government-owned drawings and technical data packages they are using to establish new sources and to competitively procure parts that were formerly sole sourced. While this is an important tool, reverse engineering cannot be used for every problem part. We in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment are absolutely committed to delivering and sustaining preeminent capabilities for the warfighter. Our contracting officers' ability to negotiate fair and reasonable prices translates directly to maximizing those capabilities. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Howley, you are now recognized for your testimony. Mr. Howley.
Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Comer, and distinguished members of the committee. Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to appear at today's hearing. I'm Nick Howley. I'm chairman and founder of the TransDigm Group, and I served as CEO until 2018. Since retiring, I focused much of my time working with the Howley Foundation, a charitable foundation that began in 2003 and focuses exclusively on providing improved educational opportunities for economically disadvantaged inner city students. As an example, in 2022 alone, we provide 750 students with scholarships and related support to attend grade schools, high schools, and colleges, in addition to funding and managing various other inner city education programs. I'm here today to speak about the aerospace industry and TransDigm's and the work TransDigm businesses do every day to provide highly engineered aircraft components for our commercial and government customers. TransDigm is an American manufacturing company with over 100 manufacturing plants. We provide well-paying jobs to roughly 13,000 individuals, most of whom are in the United States and many of whom are union members. In an era when the domestic supply chain is vulnerable and the government is spending billions to incentivize companies to bring manufacturing back to the United States, our businesses continue to domestically produce quality products that are essential to keeping Americans strong. We are primarily a commercial company with well over 90% of our revenues going to customers other than the US government. Our largest customer group is the worldwide commercial airline industry, such as United Airlines or Delta Airlines. Our next largest customers are typically Boeing and Airbus, the leading manufacturers of commercial passenger airplanes. Our companies produce a broad range of engineered aerospace components found in major commercial airlines, including advanced cockpit avionics, cargo handling systems, engine ignition systems, communication software, and antenna systems. Each year, we introduce a range of new and improved products, primarily for commercial airplanes, but also for defense programs. We typically fund the engineering, testing, tooling, and startup of these products at our own expense. After the September 11th attack, we quickly developed and quickly produced the critical cockpit security door systems that protect the aircraft and keep passengers safe. We also manufactured the state-of-the-art parachute and actuators that safely landed and then helped operate the Mars Perseverance rover. In response to COVID, we are developing antimicrobial and touchless technology for commercial air travel. The structure of the commercial and defense aerospace industry for our type of components is pretty similar across the world. Airplane manufacturers, known as OEMs, like Boeing and Airbus, have suppliers like us compete for the original design and selection of the part. The engineering, tooling, and startup costs are borne by us, and we don't always win. Once a supplier is selected after this robust competition, so long as the supplier continues to produce quality products on time, the supplier typically keeps the business. But if the supplier does not provide the customer with adequate value, there is a commercial industry that actively tries to reverse engineer the parts. This generally does not happen to us because we are a good, high-value supplier. TransDigm is not primarily a defense contractor. Our direct contracts with the DoD represent a small fraction of our revenue. The defense contracts for our businesses are almost exclusively through firm fixed-price contracts. We rarely have cost-plus contracts where the contractor receives a markup on cost and the government bears all the risk of increased cost. Unlike many traditional defense contractors, we shoulder the risk of delays, cost fluctuations, and other potential losses. We also take the risk that the DoD will elect not to buy from us, or will buy in such low quantities that the program is not economically viable. In fact, the report noted that 61 of the 107 parts in the audit lacked procurement history data sufficient to perform an analysis. In many cases, DoD went more than 5 years between procurements. We also work to be good corporate citizens, including supporting the provision of quality, affordable broadband for underserved neighborhoods, and establishing college scholarships for minority students interested in engineering and business. I am proud of all that our team has done over the past 30 years and continues to do to make TransDigm a premier American developer and manufacturer. My colleague, Kevin Stein, will provide an overview of our company's deep concerns regarding the Inspector General audit report that is the subject of today's hearing, so I will not reiterate those points. I do want to reiterate TransDigm's dedication to being a partner with the DoD in creating long-term solutions to acquisition industries. As the IG report indicates, TransDigm Group follows all laws and regulations, and we will, of course, continue to do so. We value our work with the DoD, and we're proud to provide our support. Thanks for the invitation to appear, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you. Mr. Stein, you are now recognized for your testimony.
Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Comer, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today. I am joined by our founder, Nick Howley. The DoD's Inspector General completed an audit last month in which they reviewed firm fixed price contracts awarded to TransDigm businesses. The contracts were from the same general time period as the last audit and predated the 2019 hearing before this committee. During the audit, we engaged in an open exchange with the IG, providing access to thousands of pages of documents, regular meetings, and tours of many of our factories. The IG team even commended us for our cooperation and transparency. Since the 2019 hearing, we have instituted initiatives to improve communication with DoD. First, we worked with DoD to establish a working group to identify and address acquisition and pricing issues. This has been helpful in addressing various matters over the last 2 years. Second, we have proactively been providing more information to DoD to facilitate the determination of price reasonableness. We have also proactively been offering volume discounts. Finally, we hired independent experts to train employees on requirements related to DoD contracting. We believe these efforts have improved procurements. I would now like to turn to the report. We are deeply concerned with the fundamental errors in this report, which we communicated to the IG and their counsel. First, we provided complete cost information for the parts reviewed in this audit. However, the IG arbitrarily excluded nearly $10 million in federal taxes that we paid and interest paid by us. Remarkably, the report says that the IG's exclusion should not be interpreted to mean that the DoD should exclude interest and taxes in negotiating fixed price contracts. This is not the only occasion that IG creates arbitrary standards and applies them only to TransDigm and blatantly states that it is doing so. Second, the report creates a 15% profit limit for fixed price contracts. This limit does not exist in law or policy. The report acknowledges that there are no profit thresholds in the FAR for these kinds of contracts, and that they used an inapplicable standard meant for contracts in which the government, not the contractor, takes the risk of overruns. The report itself specifically states, and I quote, "We are not stating that 15% should be used as a benchmark when negotiating firm fixed price contracts. We reiterate that nothing in this report states or should be interpreted to mean that the IG advocates a 15% profit ceiling or any other specified profit ceiling on fixed price contracts," close quote. So again, the IG expressly acknowledges that the standard they used for this report was unique and should not apply to other DoD contracts. Third, most of our sales to DoD are for products derived from parts used on commercial aircraft. But the IG failed to acknowledge that the majority of the audited parts have commercial equivalents, and that on average, DoD received a 25% discount to the commercial price of those parts. I repeat, on average, DoD received a 25% discount. And the IG knew that. The FAR requires DoD to evaluate commercially comparable pricing first and only then consider cost. The report incorrectly claims that there is no way to evaluate price on sole source parts. However, most airline parts can be found on multiple platforms and are made by multiple companies, and even when a part is sole sourced on a particular platform. So DoD can compare our products with others in the market to see that the prices are fair and reasonable. That is exactly what Congress intended with the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act and subsequent laws. The question is supposed to be not how much it costs to produce a part, but whether the government is getting a fair and reasonable price. The audit does the opposite, in direct conflict with congressional intent. By using these arbitrary standards and ignoring legitimate costs and reams of information we provided in support of price reasonableness, the IG was able to come up with inflammatory profit percentages that make a good headline, but ignore basic facts. Further, the report creates these arbitrary standards, not for all companies, but only for TransDigm. The report itself contains an extraordinary admission that even the IG doesn't support using these standards for fixed price contracts. As a final matter, in our invitation to testify, we were asked whether we will voluntarily pay the amount deemed excessive in the report. Once we receive all of the requests from the DoD, we will evaluate them. We look forward to working with DoD to come to a resolution on this and to establish a plan for going forward. However, we remain deeply concerned with the arbitrary standards used in this report. The policy the IG invented in this report will disincentivize businesses from accepting firm fixed price contracts with the government. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Mr. Hall, the independent audit report from your office shows that TransDigm is routinely overcharging the Defense Department. Your team analyzed TransDigm's costs to manufacture 106 spare parts and compared that to prices charged to DoD for those same items. You found that TransDigm received excess profits on all but one of those parts, 105 out of 106 parts. Is that right, Ms. Hall?
Thank you, Chairwoman. Yes, that is what we found. We found that TransDigm earned excess profit of $20.8 million on 105 of the 107 parts that we looked at.
Okay, before us now is a chart with some of the worst examples of excess profit you found in your review. All 4 of these examples have excess profits above 500%. 2 of the parts have profit margins above 2,000%. 1 part has a profit margin of nearly 4,000%. Mr. Stein, according to the IG's report, contracting officers requested uncertified cost data for 26 of the spare parts the IG reviewed in order to help them determine whether TransDigm's price was fair and reasonable. TransDigm refused to provide the cost data for 24 of those parts, all but 2. Is that right?
That is correct.
TransDigm could have provided data on its costs, but the company refused, so it could charge outrageous prices. It's simply wrong to do that, to have a 4,000% profit for spare parts that our military needs. The IG recommended DoD seek repayment of the $20.8 million in excess profit, and I understand that DoD agreed with that recommendation and has notified TransDigm it is seeking repayment. Mr. Tenaglia, has DOD received a check from TransDigm yet?
Chairwoman Maloney, the Defense Logistics Agency has corresponded with TransDigm, indicated their intent to pursue that refund. The refund has not been received as of yet, but they're working with the company on that matter.
So, Mr. Stein, is TransDigm planning to pay back the full 20.8 million? Yes or no?
As I said in my opening statements, we think there are significant legal and accounting issues with this report. I can talk about some of those parts that you just had up on the screen. One of those, a quick disconnect coupling. You only bought 13 of those over 5 years, 13 pieces. Imagine interrupting a manufacturing company to make a part once in a great while, and then expect them to understand their costs or to understand what it is. We're a commercial company. Even on that part that you were referring to, you received a 2% discount from commercial. You're still getting a discount. It costs us much more to do business with the federal government and the DOD than it does to do business with commercial companies.
Reclaiming my time, if they could have bought it commercially, they would have. I am calling on you right now to pay back the more than 20 million TransDigm owes taxpayers. In addition to clawing back this taxpayer money, we need to empower contracting officials to prevent companies from manipulating the contract process to obtain excessive profits in the first place. Today, I am introducing a draft bill, which I'd like everyone to comment on, to require contractors to provide cost data that a contracting officer needs to determine whether prices are fair and reasonable, data that TransDigm refused to provide. Mr. Tenaglia, would having access to cost data help contracting officers ensure that contractors like TransDigm are not overcharging our military?
Yes, I believe access to cost data would give our contracting officers a better chance to negotiate fair and reasonable prices. I do want to comment, in addition, as Mr. Stein mentioned, the hierarchy that we use to request information from companies, particularly in sole source situations for commercial products, could eventually result in our requesting cost information. We do seek to obtain other relevant information, whether it's historical prices paid for commercial parts in the industry. But lacking that relevant information, we will seek contract cost data as a last resort, yes.
And I urge all of my colleagues to co-sponsor this bill and work with us to empower contracting officers to protect taxpayer dollars. I now recognize the gentle lady from North Carolina, Ms. Fox. You are now recognized, Virginia Fox.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. And I appreciate our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Tenaglia, the recent DOD Inspector General report states that current statutory and regulatory requirements discourage contracting officers from asking for uncertified cost and pricing data. Why would contracting officers be discouraged from seeking that data?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for that question. They are discouraged because other means of establishing fair and reasonable prices, including looking at analogous parts. Some of these parts that we're talking about are sold in the commercial aviation industry, and where we can make those analogies on pricing and look at the sales data associated with that part to the, let's say, the airlines, then that would be the most relevant point of comparison. That indicates what commercial competitive market forces establish that price to be. And so that would be our first priority for looking at that. However, if there's not relevant comparable parts that are being sold in the commercial marketplace, then we might revert to requesting cost information as a means to understand the true price of that product.
I have another question for you. When negotiating a contract for a sole source part, do contracting officers explore the ability to obtain intellectual property rights? while this may make the initial buy more expensive, do you think it would drive down costs by creating competition in the long run?
For the most part, for the parts we're talking about in the sustainment environment of spare parts, that is not typically part of the calculus in terms of Defense Logistics Agency looking to actually acquire the intellectual property for those parts. Those decisions really are made much earlier in the life cycle of our products. We are examining that. We have a focus right now on competition, as I illustrated in my statement. And part of that involves the effective management of intellectual property at the beginning of a product's life cycle.
I think this is a big loophole that we have here that could save the American taxpayers billions and billions of dollars. And I know how long it takes to look into something, particularly at the DoD. And I want to urge you to move this along, because we are spending way too much money because you've signed these sole source contracts, and other companies could be providing the parts a lot less expensively if you were to get that intellectual property. This is an issue I'm very, very familiar with. I have another question for you. The DoD Inspector General report states that the Defense Logistics Agency is working on initiatives to help ensure that DoD receives fair and reasonable prices on spare parts, including an initiative to reverse engineer parts. What advantages does the DoD gain when it reverse engineers a part, and does this increase competition?
Yes, Congresswoman, absolutely. That is the objective, to increase competition by having the government own the technical data package associated with that, so we can put it out for competitive bid. There's a limited opportunity for us to do that. Our engineers will assess products that are candidates for reverse engineering and take a look and see what the potential return on investment might be. But each one of those engineering analysis are backed up with an understanding of how much risk it might be to source that to an alternative supplier. There's a limited capacity for us to do that. We certainly are taking opportunities to do that, and DLA has, I can give you all the details about the TransDigm products, but it's a larger issue for the DLA. The initiative to use companies to help us create those technical data packages so that we can compete the manufactured product.
I have a question for Ms. Hull. The DoD Inspector General report notes that DoD policies do not compel contractors to provide uncertified cost data for contracts below the TINA threshold when requested, and encourages the department to explore alternative contracting strategies when negotiating with companies that sell sole source parts in small quantities of low dollar values. Could you explain what alternative contracting strategies DoD could utilize to better determine fair and reasonable prices?
Yes, one of the alternative contracting strategies that we highlighted in the report was the use of the DPC in coordination with DLA to look at the buys that DoD purchases on the TransDigm contracts. In fact, according to TransDigm officials, DoD buys fewer than 25 spare parts per contract on 60% of the TransDigm spare parts sold to the DoD. So there's opportunity there to combine the purchases of the parts to potentially get savings for the DoD.
Yes, and I want to agree with what the ranking member said at the beginning. I don't think we should be picking on any one company, particularly an American-owned company here. I think what we need to do is have the DoD be much more open and transparent on the way it does business, and again, save the American people a lot of money. I have one more question for Ms.
Excuse me, the gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I can't find a clock here, so thank you very much. I apologize.
All right.
Okay.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you for your questions. And but it's hard for the DoD to be transparent if they cannot get the information from the contractor, which is what my legislation will do. So I ask you to take a serious look at it. It will have more transparency and therefore result in lower prices going forward. So please take a serious look at it. And I now call on the gentle lady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton. You are now recognized. Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate this important hearing. Mr. Hull, when the former chairman, Eliza Cummings, requested that the DOD Inspector General conduct an audit of TransDigm's contracts, Senator Chuck Grassley, he's been referred to by the chair, joined the request and asked that your audit include a review of TransDigm's business model. The resulting IG audit described TransDigm's acquisition strategy as, and here I'm quoting, focused on obtaining businesses that design and manufacture sole source aerospace components. Your report also noted that these businesses often sell spare parts to the government for older aircrafts. Now, that means that the companies TransDigm acquire are often the only place for DOD to go to buy a spare part needed for an aircraft. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes. TransDigm's business model focuses on acquiring business units that are that specialize in highly engineered sole source spare parts. So that creates a situation in which DoD has one person they can go to for that part. In this case, the TransDigm operating unit.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hull. Now, this question is for Mr. Tenaglia. You mentioned in your written testimony that one method that DOD is using to address concerns related to sole source items is to encourage contracting officers to escalate to leadership instances whereby they are unable to obtain cost data. How often do contracting officers escalate problems with obtaining cost data from sole source contracts? And are these escalations ultimately successful?
Thank you for the question. The escalation process that we've established is designed really to put senior leadership attention on the matter, whether it's on the government side here in the Department of Defense, and also on the corporate side. So the open channels of communication we've established with the TransDigm corporate leadership through the working group that I described. We'd like it to not get to that point. Ideally, at the working level, our contracting officers can deal with officials in TransDigm or any other company without needing to elevate the matter to a higher level. And what we're talking about is requests for information. The information is not always requests for cost information. It could be requests for other supporting documentation so the contracting officer can establish a fair and reasonable price.
Can you say how often this escalation to leadership occurs, and whether it's successful?
It is successful in some cases. How often? So we've had 2 reports to the Congress. In the first report to the Congress, summarizing the number of instances of elevation, last year was 83. This year it went significantly up. We just submitted that report to the Congress last week. I'll be happy to provide that to the committee through the appropriate channels. The success of actually resolving the matter is really dependent on individual leaders, on both sides, primarily with the company, if we can convince them that we need the information. But we'd rather not let it get to the point of elevating to senior levels, because we're talking about the heads of contracting activities for the major components of the department, at Defense Logistics Agency and the military departments. We really need the contracting officers who are empowered and warranted to do their job to get the information they need from companies, not just this company, but any company that where we're negotiating.
Mr. Howley, just in a sample of 107 spare parts included in your audit, TransDigm was the sole source manufacturer for 94 out of 107 of those parts. Isn't that correct?
I'm sorry, I think you, if you're asking me, I'm not sure who you're asking. Yes, that is true. We believe, however, that 100% of the parts are actually commercial, and that we offered a discount to the commercial price of 25% on this entire audited basket of contracts. 25% discount to the available commercial price. This is not gouging. It simply is not.
The gentleman's time and the gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, is now recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Heiss.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I recall during the hearing on this same topic in 2019 that then I expressed my concern regarding TransDigm's business practices. It appeared clear that the American taxpayers were getting ripped off and that TransDigm should pay back the money. But here we are again going over the exact same situation. Committee Democrats here today are holding this hearing presumably to present themselves as being tough on things like waste, fraud, and abuse. But I find that extremely difficult for anyone with a reasonable mindset to buy into and to believe. I mean, here today, Democrats are going to hold up TransDigm as though they were some sort of trophy to be exhibited on the wall, when literally trillions of dollars have gone out the door from the Biden administration, much of it for dubious so-called COVID relief measures. Just by itself, for example, unemployment insurance fraud by itself could run into hundreds of billions of dollars. What is this committee doing about it to address those kinds of concerns? And yet here we are. The Democrats are bringing this company back as an encore, if you will, for practices that, yes, might be unsavory, but certainly not illegal. And even if the definition itself of excessive profits is pretty much has been made up by the Inspector General. It's not a matter of regulation, nor is it a matter of statute. This committee had jurisdiction over hundreds of billions of dollars in spending for state, local, and tribal governments through the Inflation Creation Act, that bill which others may refer to as the American Rescue Plan. But what has this committee done to look at where that money was spent? Does this committee have any idea what those monies were spent on and what impact it did or did not have? So if there's a problem here today, quite frankly, my opinion is that the problem is with the DOD's failure to do a better job forecasting its needs and administering its contracts. These underlying acquisition regulations leave DOD exposed for the kinds of tactics that we're here today yet again talking about. So with that, Mr. Tenaglia, let me throw one out to you. In the last 18 months since the last hearing on this same subject, what has DOD done differently to protect the interests of the taxpayers?
Thank you, Congressman. So since the last hearing, we've taken a number of steps to work with this particular company to refine the process we have with our contracting officers, to empower them to request information, to encourage them to request information, not just cost information, but the information that they need. And so there's a training aspect to that. We have a cadre of pricing experts that we've formed across the various components of the department, making sure that they understand this issue. And I would say that this issue presents itself, again, not just with this company, but across the board, where we're negotiating commercial items. And a lot of the dollars we're talking about today, all the dollars we're talking about today, flow through prime contracts. My office has purview over looking at the largest negotiations the department has in the sole source arena. And in doing so, we focus very intently on the dollars that flow through the subcontracts. And so that is an area of emphasis, again, empowering our contracting officers to know what information they should be requesting, what areas they should. We're really about trying to get the best deal for the taxpayer.
So let me ask you this: and has the DoD actually improved its ability to forecast its own needs and to avoid this one-off or small item purchases like we're talking about today?
So I've had those discussions with the Defense Logistics Agency, and we accept the IG's recommendation for alternative pricing strategies that do include some of the aggregation techniques that the ranking member mentioned. So we will be looking at that. It's balanced, however, with the carrying cost of inventory for the parts at DLA. As for many of these parts, they respond to the demand signal of the warfighter who presents the requirements, and DLA is the supplier of those products for the rest of the department. But there is potential for aggregated buys, and we'll look at that as an alternate.
So it's
The gentleman's time has expired, and I'd like to respond to Mr. Heiss. Today, we are examining overcharging by a defense contractor. It's true, we looked at him in 2019, but they have continued to overcharge millions of dollars, and we are trying to stop it. And this overcharging has cost taxpayers millions. So if you care, or my Republican colleagues care about waste, fraud, and abuse, you should care about this hearing. And I hope you'll take a serious look and help us with the passage of legislation that will stop it. I now recognize a gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley. Mr. Conley, you're recognized.
Millions of waste is being ignored, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And I do find it amazing that my friends on the other side of the aisle all of a sudden become apologists for price gouging and by anyone's standards, excessive profits, and want to resist the very oversight they claim they want with respect to this administration and the ongoing COVID crisis. So I commend the chairwoman for having this hearing and for updating us on what, if any, progress has been achieved in the interim 2 years since we last had an oversight hearing on this matter. Ms. Hull, at our last hearing, and I believe at this one as well, we talked about cooperation on documentation and the fact that DoD was somewhat hampered by the fact that documentation was not provided by the vendor, in this case, TransDigm. Is that still the case, that we're not getting documents that have been requested by the contract office in DoD in order to provide some kind of analytical framework for determining a fair and reasonable price?
Yes, in our current audit, or this past audit, the contracting officers asked for cost information 26 times and only received it twice from TransDigm. So they're still encountering the similar problems.
Dr. Stein, at our last hearing, I asked you about this issue and you kind of danced around it. Why isn't TransDigm providing the documentation requested by DoD so that both parties can be happy with what it could be mutually arrived at a fair and reasonable price and a fair and reasonable return on your investment?
Congressman Connolly, I appreciate that question. I feel like I'm in a bit of double jeopardy, as we audited, the IG audited the same time period as the last audit, and we audited some of the exact same parts. Why would we expect there to be a different answer? We went back in time and audited the same.
Dr. Stein, the question is really simple. You just heard Teresa Hall say that out of 26 documentation requests, you only complied with 2 of them. Why is that? Why aren't you? Why not have full transparency and provide the information and documentation that DoD says it needs to determine a fair and reasonable price.
So of the 154 contracts that were audited, they only asked for that on 26 of them. And we thought at the time, we thought the process, since they're commercial, they've always been commercial, that you should be able to use commercial invoices. So we didn't see the point of giving our critical information out. Now,
All right.
since the audit.
Wait, Mr. Dr. Stein, this is not, unfortunately, this is very time limited in my part.
I know, I understand.
So you made a conscious decision as a corporation not to comply with a documentation information request from DOD with respect to these pending contracts.
We did provide commercial qualification packages on all of the parts. So everything is commercial. Everything has now been given to the IG. At the time of contracting.
Let me just interpret what I'm hearing you say. So you're taking direct issue with Teresa Hull in her assertion that you only complied with 2 of the 26 requests. You're arguing, well, actually, that's technically true, but more broadly, we did comply by allowing that commercial information available to you.
Yeah, that's correct. That is correct.
All right. Teresa Hull, this 15% threshold, I think to many people seems very arbitrary. So you looked at profit margins in the range of 8 to 22%, and you somewhat arbitrarily said 15 is the happy medium for the purpose of our examining not only cost structure, but profit that is extracted from that cost structure. Is that correct?
Yes, but the 15%, we were asked by the committee to look at the specific date ranges for specific thresholds, and we included all of the spare parts included in that time period.
All right, I get that, but I'm trying to just look at how we arrive at 15, because I do think it isn't. I'm sorry?
The 15%, we looked at the cost information that TransDigm provided, and in order to determine a fair and reasonable price, we had to compare to a benchmark. The 15% is not arbitrary. It is within the range of the aerospace companies that practice market-based pricing, which is between 8 and 22%. Also, I'd like to note that we have over 20 years of spare parts pricing reports that use benchmarks in the range of 13.3 to 18%. So that 15% falls within that range as well.
And
the gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grossman, is recognized.
There we are. That was kind of exciting in the background there.
Yeah.
Mr. Tenaglia, we're going to ask you a couple of questions here. Understanding that procuring in the sole source environment is difficult and can lead to exploitation, have you or anyone else made efforts to instruct contracting officers to actively look for parts that could meet the requirements that are similar to those produced by sole source providers?
Yes, Congressman, that's part of the market research that's undertaken across the department for commercial items. In this particular instance, we're talking about national stock items that the Defense Logistics Agency is responding to the requirements of the military departments. Most of those parts are specified, whether there's an alternate source or alternate part. That's part of the calculus, but in most cases, there is one particular part, and in many of these cases, one particular manufacturer for the part that's available. That's a function of the dynamics of the market, where only one provider is making that particular item. And if that's the case, and then we're into the scenario that we're talking about today, negotiating on a sole source basis.
Are there any efforts to increase competition in the spare parts space? Can you think of anything we could do?
Well, the reverse engineering is a good example. I want to downplay the extent to which we can use that across the board for every part. We really can't. Each one of those requires the engineering analysis behind it. But ultimately, what we do there is we have the technical data package that we can compete the spare parts once we go through that process.
When procuring an original system, do you consider if any of the parts are sole source? Is that a factor?
We certainly do. At the very beginning of any weapon system life cycle, we generally do enjoy competition. It's once you get into the sustainment environment, as was described earlier in this hearing, competition is more challenging because companies that have developed these products at the outset have that intellectual property, and then it's up to the department to either identify alternate sources or reverse engineer in the examples that we've talked about.
Okay, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Stein, I'll ask you a question. Would you say that much of your business with the government is in the aftermarket sustainment space?
6% of our business today is directly to the government.
Okay. When bidding with an original equipment manufacturer for the original system procurement, do you analyze the potential for aftermarket contracts?
We don't. We look at, can we develop and design a part that makes sense? Can we meet the design criteria that the OEM is requiring? And then it's a competitive process. There are many companies involved in bidding. Only one is down selected, and that's a decision made by the OEM, not by us. And that's the nature of these highly engineered, extremely low volume parts that you end up selling to the DoD.
Is it encouraged that your subsidiaries find contracts that will have larger aftermarket potential?
Well, aftermarket is an important part of our business. We want highly engineered products, and many of those happen to have aftermarket content. So it's not that we're exclusively looking for those. What we don't want are commodities. We want to invest in engineering, new product development. That's what we get excited about, and that's part of our business model.
Okay. Can you explain the difference between a proprietary part and one for which you are the sole source?
Well, a proprietary part simply means that you developed it. So here, let me hold you examples. Here I have in front of me, and hopefully you can see them, I have a Boeing 737 actuator and a B-1 bomber actuator. They're the same. You can't tell them the difference in them. The fact that we developed the 737 actuator on our own dime and can transfer that development and technology to the B-1 bomber means that, and we sell this at a lower price. We give the government a discount to what we charge every other airline in the world. And I have lots of examples. That's an actuator. These are pitot tubes. Pitot tubes are what measure airspeed. This is a military, this is a commercial. They're identical. There's no difference in those. This is what we provide. When we show that there's a commercial part and we're selling you this commercial part in whatever package you want it, and we're giving it to you at a discount. There is no gouging or overcharging.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, is now recognized. You need to unmute.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for calling this important hearing. I just would want to begin by framing this in the historical context. I mean, defense contractor fraud, military fraud goes back to the 19th century. Abraham Lincoln complained about it, which is why we have the Ketam process. But billions and billions of dollars have been ripped off from American taxpayers, as established in both thousands of criminal cases as well as civil cases, reclaiming money for the taxpayers. Ms. Hull, I want to give you the chance to respond to some of the statements that TransDigm made about the IG report. Mr. Stein said that the IG audit has fundamental legal and accounting errors, and even the DoD IG doesn't support the standard that was used for TransDigm's audit. How would you respond to those statements?
Thank you for the question and the opportunity to respond to the statements made about our report. TransDigm took a lot of those statements out of context. In fact, we performed this audit under generally accepted government auditing principles, which we followed robustly. And in our report, we distinguish in our scope and methodology section exactly what we did, exactly what we looked at. So for this audit, we applied a 15% profit rate based on what we looked at with the cost data I mentioned earlier. It falls within the range of the 13.3 and 18% benchmark we've used on over 20 years of auditing the spare parts environment. Also, as far
Can I
as
just
the
stop you there for a
interest.
second? I mean, that's really nitpicking when we're talking about 1,000% profit margin in some cases that was made by the contractor here. So whether you call it 15, 20, or 25%, I mean, we're looking at ludicrous hyper billing of the government, right?
Correct. The environment that the Department of Defense has to negotiate in right now with TransDigm is very cumbersome because they are a sole source. They've created this sole source environment, and in a sole source environment, there aren't competitive market forces. There aren't other alternatives. And Mr. Stein mentioned commercial packages that his company provided to our audit team. I'd like to note that in those packages, we did not see like quantities for comparison, which would have been a fundamental consideration for our analysis. And also fundamentally, a contracting officer determines the commerciality, not an audit team and not a government contractor. So in this case,
Uh-oh.
Well, Madam Chair, I'll complete my questioning of her afterwards. Let me go to Mr. Howley. Do you agree with the IG's finding that TransDigm did refuse to provide the cost data in 24 cases when it was requested by the contracting officers?
I don't know the specific answer on those 24 parts. What I will say is that almost every one of these parts is a commercial part. The preferred way of doing price analysis here in the FARs, it gives a preferred way of doing it. And the preferred way is to compare it to price data, comparable commercial price data. We submitted the commercial price data and the commercial justification for every product. And in total, the government is buying at a 25% discount to the commercial price, not the commercial price on some price list, but the commercial price that commercial customers are paying. And that is the preferred method of doing this as defined in the regulation, not cost analysis.
But why would you not provide the cost data in those 24 cases, which ended up being exorbitantly overpriced?
I'll repeat the same thing. The regulations that govern this have a specific methodology by which you determine reasonableness of price. And commercial pricing is a preferred method.
I got you. So, I mean, essentially,
I'd also add another.
Forgive me, I'll give you a chance in a minute if I've got it. But the point I want to make here is the point some of my colleagues have made, which is, well, this is perfectly legal. When they asked you that question, you were under no obligation to answer. So the question is really the one being posed by the chair. Do we need to change that rule for contracts under $2 million? Because it looks like a gaping loophole where the contracting officers can try to determine what the cost is. The contractors have no reason to comply with that. They don't. And of course, the taxpayers get ripped off because of it. I mean, there's that one email saying that turning over the information would make a $40 to $50 million ballpark difference in terms of the profitability of the contract. So, you guys are operating within the rules as they're written, and I think that should be an incentive for us to change those rules because it's a ripoff of the taxpayers.
Thank you, Mr. Raskin. Your time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cloud, is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This, of course, is an important topic. I do find it odd that the same people who've advocated for trillions in wasteful spending over the last year are suddenly fiscal hawks when it comes to this. This is an important topic, especially, of course, as we are facing new challenges. We need to realize that efficiency has to be a competitive edge for our DoD and a patriotic duty for the companies that we're contracting with, of course. My only question in this hearing is why we're only looking at one company and why we're only talking about 15 to 20 million when we have $1 trillion contracts that remain backlogged, wasting billions of dollars. We saw Biden leave $85 billion in military hardware to a terrorist organization. And today we're talking about 15 to 20 million, which is important, but I think it's more of a systemic, larger issue when we should be looking at all the issues when it comes to military contracting, well, that's really wasting billions, not millions. But today we're talking about the 15 to 20 million. So Mr. Tenaglia, can you talk about just-in-time inventory, sole source contracting? They place DoD in a position of paying more for spare parts and decreasing readiness. These are long-standing issues, never been fully addressed. What can DoD do to reform the acquisition process?
Thank you, Congressman. So, as I mentioned earlier, part of the calculus in deciding how many of these parts we can buy at any one time is the carrying cost, the inventory cost for DLA to hold that. There's the fiscal pressure to purchase the items that are needed instantaneously, and the warfighter expects DLA to respond and having those on stock. And so that has driven the need to purchase in some of the smaller quantities that we've talked about. For the sole source scenario, I wanted to come back to Mr. Stein's description of the two parts. And certainly I agree where the part is exactly the same as that is sold in the commercial marketplace, then we have confidence that the fairness of the price, but let's say the airline paid for that exact same part, would be a fair price. Where we run into difficulties is when we look at these items that are not the same. They're somewhat comparable, but they're more what we call of a type, of a commercial of a type, meaning you can't go out and see that exact same product and understand what the price of it is when it's subjected to competitive market forces.
How do we, this has been a long-standing question, how do we build in incentive within the DoD for bargaining? When you're a contractor and you're negotiating these deals, it seems to me like there's not much incentive to push for the lower price for the American people. Businesses are trying to operate in a competitive environment. We'd like them each, of course, to keep in mind the overall patriotic goal of what we're trying to produce efficiently, but they're also competing against other companies in that space. And it seems like how can we better incentivize the DoD contractors to negotiate better in this? I'd like us to expand this conversation to contracting, because it seems like we constantly put in contracts that never get fulfilled on time or on budget. We continue to pay them anyway. That's where the billions are being wasted as opposed to what we're talking about today. But if you could address that.
All right, I think competition is the key. We have our men and women who wear the uniform of this country enjoy the weapon systems and that they really need to have the decisive advantage in any adversary conflict. And so I'm proud of the fact that our defense acquisition workforce brings and delivers those capabilities to the warfighter. So there's a lot of cause to look at the positive side of that. If you look at the weapon systems that have been deployed for this nation, many of those originated through competition, and I think coming back to that, so the extent to which we're effective in competing these requirements will be better off for the taxpayers.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I yield back.
Yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Rocana, is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Rocana.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your leadership. I'll remind this committee that we had a bipartisan hearing in 2019 and calls on both the Democratic and Republican side to have TransDigm reimburse the federal government $16.1 million. They did the right thing then. They must reimburse the government at least $20.8 million, the excess profit finding. Let me start with Ms. Hull. Do you agree that that's the least TransDigm can do in reimbursing the government for that?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I stand by our report that the 20.8 million that TransDigm earned excess profits on the 105 spare parts should be refunded to the government.
I mean, it would be unconscionable, in my view, for them not to do that, given that they admitted their error last time. I hope they will. Let me ask you, General Glenn Fine said when he was before us in 2019, we ought to look to the legislative structure to require companies to provide cost information, but when asked by contracting officers. Basically, if the DoD wants to buy something and asks the company for the cost, they should be required to do so. Do you agree, Ms. Howell, that companies like TransDigm should be required to provide uncertified cost data when the contracting officer deems it necessary?
Yes, I agree that when a contracting officer is unable to determine a fair and reasonable price and asks a contractor, especially in a sole source environment, they should obtain the data that they request.
Mr. Tenaglia, if contracting officers could require contractors like TransDigm to provide uncertified cost data, would that empower our government, our Pentagon to make better buying decisions?
Yes, I believe it would. And central to that is the judgment that our contracting officers exercise in getting to the point where they've decided that that is necessary to establish fair and reasonable pricing, using the hierarchy of other means of established that price.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I ask for unanimous consent to place in the record a written testimony from Mandy Smithberger, Director at the Project of Government Oversight. She wrote, quote, "It is time for Congress. It is time for Congress to stop enabling contractor overpricing. The problems identified by this watchdog report and other reports are only the tip of the iceberg, but the solutions are clear. They can only be fixed if Congress gets serious and takes action." Madam Chair, you have gotten serious. You're taking action with the bill, the Fair Pricing with Cost Transparency Act, that would require contractors to provide uncertified cost information. I'm joining you in supporting that. I hope everyone on the committee will. Mr. Tenaglia, this bill is based on the legislative proposal from the DoD, so I assume you would support changing the law for DoD contractors. Is that right?
Yes, Congressman, I look forward to working with your committee and understanding how that legislation would help us.
Mr. Howley, last time you came before the committee, you denied, you obfuscated, et cetera. I said you're going to end up paying the 16.1 million. You disagreed. You went back. People told you pay the 16.1 million. You want to skip those steps and just tell us today that you're going to pay the 20.8 million?
Nick?
Apologize. I have to unmute. I think I'm unmuted now. Let me start by saying we are primarily a commercial company. The Department of Defense, though, is a not our largest customer by a fair amount, but they're an important customer.
Mr. Howley, I don't want to be disrespectful. It's a simple question. Are you going to pay it or you're not going to pay it? And all it's a simple yes or no.
You answered the question and I'll attempt to answer it. The last thing we want, we do not like an unhappy, antagonized customer. What we want to do is we want to get to the bottom of the facts so that everyone understands the facts clearly, at which point we can see what kind of resolution we can have here. We cannot go forward with a assertion.
I'll take that as a yes.
You'll take it. You can take it as a yes. You can take that incorrectly as a yes. We cannot go forward without the facts being clearly stated and clearly understood.
Madam Chairman.
It's unfortunate. I thought you were going to do it. My prediction is you will do it. It'd be better for you to just say here you're going to do it.
Madam Chairman, point of parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman's time has expired, and what is your point, Mr. Sessions?
My point would be, is this a negotiation with the company or a hearing?
That's not a parliamentary. That is not a parliamentarian inquiry. I now recognize from Ohio, Mr. Gibbs, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To Ms. Hall, just to be clear, that you found that TransDigm did not violate any law or policy in your audit, correct? Say yes or no.
Yes, I did not.
Okay,
We did not
okay,
determine they did anything
okay.
illegally.
And that the government, found that these prices were fair and reasonable, and yet they entered into the contracts. I guess my thought here is these are firm, fixed price contracts. And it sounds like we're negotiating the contract after the contract's been filled. What kind of negotiation happens before the contract is signed on both parties? So I guess first question, I'll go to Dr. Stein. Has anybody at TransDigm ever walked away from a negotiation or contract, or has the Department of Defense walked away? What's happened here? Because it sounds like we're negotiating after the fact.
I'm not aware of anything that anyone's walked away on. What I will say is that since the last audit, we have, in the last hearing, we have implemented quite a bit of changes ourselves in how we interact with the DoD. We now offer volume discounts on all spare parts pricing to try and get around this. We have voluntarily provided cost data. We are providing more information than we ever have before. None of that was captured in this audit because, again, this audit, it's like double jeopardy. They're auditing the same time frame again. What we know is that we offered a discount to commercial, and we do not agree with the profit, artificial, arbitrary profit limits.
I think too, Dr. Stein, you can respond to this. It seems to me, if I was a manufacturer, and of course, 94% of my business was to the commercial market, only 6% to the DoD, and I've got my manufacturing lines going, and all of a sudden, they want a contract for a specialty single source item or a special item that's that's a specific item, and then you have to shut down some of your operation to make that. It's difficult to figure the cost because you got lost revenues from the production where you shut down. Is that correct?
That is correct. Often what happens is that we see orders, and then a couple days later, even you might get another order with no forecast, no notification of what's happening. You could clearly have manufactured differently if the DoD was buying in some reasonable lot quantity. Many of the parts, including in this audit, they had 61 of the 107 spare parts evaluated, did not have enough procurement history data to even perform an analysis. So if you're not buying something but once every 5-10 years, can you imagine what you have to go through from an engineering point of view to figure out how to make that part again so that it passes all the criteria that the warfighter deserves to keep them alive? This is it's nonsense almost.
Well, if these were cost plus contracts, I can understand having negotiations over what your costs are, but since they're not, it's a contract that you agreed on before you even started making the product, and everybody, you got to honor, both sides have to honor their contract, which you did, and so now they come back after the fact. It seems to be a problem. I don't quite understand how that works, and then I think it's very difficult to put in what your true cost might be when you had to.
That's true. And often we see inflationary pressures that are out of control. For a product we make in our South Carolina facility, a jet engine igniter, a critical raw material over a 3-month period went up over 300%. If we had agreed to that contract beforehand, we have no ability to get more money back out of the DoD. Because of that, we take it on risk.
So on this, the 15%, the figure that the IG put in for profit margin, is that applied to all similar companies for these types of fixed price contracts?
Not that we're aware of. No,
okay,
we believe we're the only company being targeted in this way.
Okay, so yeah, I just think there's huge issues here, how you calculate your costs, and if you both agree on it, that's an issue. You just move on forward, and you could walk away from this business if you wanted to, right? And they have to, could find the product somewhere else. And that's why when you talk about single source, it's kind of,
Yeah, it is strange in this because if TransDigm disappeared, the planes would keep flying. They would find another source.
Okay, well, my time's up, but thank you for what you do for making our country safe.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz, is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I serve as chair of the Military Construction, Veterans Affairs, and Related Agencies Appropriations Subcommittee. And our committee is committed to protecting our service members and improving their quality of life. We've pushed to improve atrocious housing standards, build child care development centers, and address PFAS contamination. While we've made great strides in these areas, there is much more that must be done to meet our obligations to care for not only those who wear the uniform, but also for their families. The challenges our troops face already make it all the more reprehensible that TransDigm would choose to fleece the American taxpayer and overcharge the Department of Defense for critical products. TransDigm supplies DoD with spare parts for Black Hawk helicopters, F-16s and F-35s. Our military is using those planes and helicopters in operations all over the world, and the spare parts that TransDigm supplies are critical to keeping those planes and helicopters flying safely. In an email that I have here obtained by the committee, a sales director of Aero Controlex, a TransDigm subsidiary, emphasized several talking points for employees to use when responding to DoD requests for cost and price data. The email says that when communicating with contracting officers, employees should be clear that the company is, quote, offering this as a solution to support the warfighter, and that you, quote, welcome all opportunities to support the government to economically procure goods to support the troops. Mr. Stein, the IG found that TransDigm's excess profits were more than 500% for dozens of spare parts sold to DoD. Do you actually consider charging DoD prices that give TransDigm a profit of more than 500% to be economical for the government?
When we look at these contracts, we lost money on 9 of the contracts audited by the IG. You are cherry picking a single part here or there that has extremely low volume on it.
No. Reclaiming my time.
12
I'm
parts
sorry.
at a time.
I'm sorry. Madam Chair, reclaiming my time. There is no reasonable benchmark that would justify the profits TransDigm obtained. You don't get to charge 500% more for parts on one part of the contract because you lost money on another part. There were more than a dozen instances where your profits were more than 500%.
Well,
that's just outrageous and unconscionable.
We object to the calculation of 500% profit. It is a non-SEC calculation that's being
reclaiming my time. Reclaiming my time. It's very clear the IG was correct that was the percentage of profit, and that is an outrage. Ms. Hull, the IG's review was limited to a small sample of approximately 3% of TransDigm's contracts, yet still identified $20.8 million in excess profit. Would you agree that in all likelihood, the total amount of excess profit could be tens of millions more?
Thank you for the question. And we looked at the specific dollar value thresholds in the time period that was requested by the committee. And we found again that the TransDigm earned excess profit of at least 20.8 million. There were other contracts that we did not include in this review. So it is possible that that number could be greater than 20.8 million.
Okay, thank you. Now, let me close, Madam Chair, with a statement from a former director of a TransDigm subsidiary. They told the committee that when TransDigm acquired their company, quote, it was disheartening since I had tried to do the right thing for the warfighter my whole career. Mr. Stein and Mr. Howley, I believe it is morally wrong for TransDigm to take advantage of our military in a time of need or any time. And I expect you to repay the $20.8 million. To me, you should be barred from future contracts for this greed and deception. And if you really cared about the troops, you would provide full cost data to the military when requested, not talking points to try to obfuscate what your true cost is. It's imperative that they know when you're trying to rip them off. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back the balance of my time.
Yeah, I thank the gentlelady for questioning, and I'd just like to clarify with Mr. Stein, building on her question. The Inspector General selected contracts awarded from 2017 through 2019 within a certain dollar amount. And I would be very happy to request a review of all of TransDigm's contracts if that is what you are requesting. So I'm going to ask you, are you requesting that? Would you like all of TransDigm's contracts to be reviewed for excess profits with the government? Yes or no?
Of course not. We
Okay,
have
all right.
made incredible
Reclaiming my
progress
time.
working with the
Reclaiming my
DoD.
time. Reclaiming my time. The gentlewoman from South Carolina, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Maloney. I appreciate you holding this hearing. I still find this astounding that we're going after a company that has employed Americans. It's pays American taxes. We're taking time that we could be devoting to, I think, as Mr. Heiss said, trillions of dollars that have been wasted by this administration. Where is the hearing on the 80 billion that was left in Afghanistan? Where is the hearing on the 420,000 per illegal that was proposed? Where is the hearing on those having those officials testify that looted and destroyed over 500 of our nice cities? Where is the hearing on the Medicaid and Medicare fraud and abuse? It's not here. We're picking an American company that again employs Americans, pays American taxes. And let me try to understand, Ms. Hull, what your decision to exclude taxes and interest from your cost calculations. Can you explain why that was made?
When we received the cost data from TransDigm, a FAR 31 principles applied, and within that specific section of the FAR, it talks to excluding interest and taxes when cost information is being used. So that is why we removed those costs from our calculations.
Was this made for similar companies providing materials that you went over and got information from?
Well, for this particular situation, we're talking about TransDigm, but we do have other reports in which we've looked at cost information and had to make a similar decisions based on information provided.
Okay, so and you're aware that TransDigm does not have to provide this. It's only 6% of their income. And it's this, do you blame them for being a sole provider?
In our report, we highlight the risk to the government when they negotiate in sole source environments. So TransDigm being a sole source company and there being no other competitive forces at play are really the issue here for why the Department of Defense is unable to get better pricing. And when the environment is completely sole source for the parts that we looked at, there really isn't a lot of options for the government. So yes, you're correct that TransDigm did not have to provide us the cost information, and they willingly provided it to the audit team to be able to calculate a fair and reasonable price.
Mr. Tenagagli, can you explain to me again about the sole source? Have you made any efforts to try to increase competition, or that's certainly not TransDigm's issue, is it?
No, Congressman, I don't think that's necessarily an issue for TransDigm to take up. There are a significant amount of transactions that we execute with TransDigm that have been coded as commercial and competitive. We do have initiatives underway to increase the extent to which we're able to compete these things. We've talked about some of those activities, such as the reverse engineering that gives us the ability to compete the manufacturing of those parts where we have situations such as these.
So that's the government's responsibility.
Yes.
If you want to go after another company that makes something that is now made by one company, that's your responsibility.
Yes.
But here you are, investigating one company and making again, it still amazes me you're excluding taxes and interest when anybody that's been in the private sector, you have to put that in before you price anything, whether it's a house, whether it's a car, whatever. And for y'all to set the 15%, again, is staggering to me as to why that's there. Mr. Howell and Mr. Stein, how much would you say that much of your business with the government is in the aftermarket sustainment space?
This piece that we're talking about right now, that's 6% of our direct sales is direct and is these spare parts.
Well, let me just say in closing, that, I find it, here we are again, going after, we majoring in the minor when it takes an American company and ignoring everything else that this administration is doing that's costing the taxpayers so much more than this. You're a private company that again is employing Americans for their livelihood. You're paying taxes that support our law enforcement, our police, and it looks to me like that you've done everything you've been asked to do. And so, Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Porter, is now recognized.
Hello, thank you. Mr. Howley, has TransDigm ever trained staff to provide, quote, the minimum amount of information to the government?
TransDigm regularly trains the staff and brings in outside consultants and lawyers.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Howley, reclaiming my time, sir. I'm sure you do all kinds of training. I'm asking a specific question and I'm going to repeat it. Has TransDigm ever trained staff to provide, quote, the minimum amount of information to the government?
I don't know the answer to that. What I know is we regularly train people in all the regulations required to deal with the government, and we insist they comply with them.
Okay. The TransDigm actually has told people that it is wrong to provide the minimum. You have told people to provide the minimum amount of information. Have you ever told staff that it is wrong to charge taxpayers lower per unit prices on higher volume orders? In other words, when we all know when we buy in bulk on Amazon, it's cheaper per unit. Has TransDigm ever told its employees that it is wrong to charge taxpayers lower per unit prices on higher volume orders?
Not that I have knowledge of or recall.
Okay, Mr. Howley, I'm introducing, here is an exhibit. This is Core Doc TDG 00034189. It's displayed on the screen so you can see it. More volume equals lower price. What does it say in big purple all cap letters? Can you read that for me?
The word's wrong.
Wrong. So would you like to modify your answer? Has TransDigm ever told staff, in light of seeing this exhibit, has TransDigm ever told its staff that it is wrong to charge taxpayers lower per unit prices on higher volume orders?
I don't know what that is. I suspect it's out of context somewhere. I suspect it's something done by one of our operating businesses at one time. I simply don't know.
Well, Mr. Howley, for $68 million a year, you need to know what's going on in your company. That's your annual salary in your retirement. In your retirement. Has TransDigm or its subsidiaries ever refused to provide price data to the military when it's requested it?
I don't know the answer to that, whether they ever have. I do
Mr.
know
Howley,
that we
Howley.
regularly provide price data, and in fact, provided commercial price data for, I believe, every part in this audit.
Mr. Howley, I just want to remind you that you're under oath as you're giving this testimony. Do you recognize these words? Quote, we didn't have to give up a dime. I'm just full of BS, and they took the bait.
I don't have knowledge or recall it.
Okay, that is from a TransDigm exhibit. You don't need to see it, but that is from a TransDigm, that is from an exhibit in this investigation. That is your salespeople talking about a deal that they just made with the military for jet engine parts in 2018. We don't have to give up a dime. Your salesperson said, I'm just full of BS. And they, being the DOD and taxpayers, took the bait. Mr. Howley, does TransDigm have a code of business ethics and conduct?
Oh, as any company does, of course we do. It's on our website.
Okay, does that code require fair dealing?
Yes. And it says what it says, but of course it requires fair dealing.
Do you think it's fair dealing to be full of bullshit and get the taxpayers to take the bait?
I don't know how to comment on that. I'm not familiar with the situation. I don't know what it is. I don't know who the person is. I don't know that. I just can't comment on it.
Mr. Holly, will you find out who that person is?
I presume you have it. You have an email. I presume you have it. I don't know who it is. I don't know.
Mr. Howley, as executive chair of the board, being paid $68 million, when a typical board member of a Fortune 100 company receives $319,000. I mean, here is the typical board member of a Fortune 100 company. See this flat line? You can't even see it. Here's you. For $68 million, you need to enforce your company's code of business ethics.
Now, time has expired. Ms. Porter, your time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, you are now recognized.
Madam Chairman, thank you very much. The questions that I would like to go down really involve this conversation that the IG is engaged in about this percentage of over earning the $20.8 million that are being berated today to pay back. I thought this was a hearing, not a negotiation. And I'm disappointed that we're going down that track. So Mr. Talia, I'm sorry, John, how do you pronounce your last name?
Tenaglia.
Mr. Tenaglia, the number that is used and that the IG used, the 20.8, does that take into account a net of working against taxes they would have paid? Or is that just the total amount of money that you see?
So the IG's use of the 15% really is an after the fact way of looking at how things played out. The way we normally negotiate contracts on the front end, we prospectively price. Let's say it was a non-commercial part, and we had the use of the record of weighted guidelines. That gives our contracting officers some structured approach to arrive at an objective profit amount. It's all subject to negotiation. I don't disagree with the methodology the IG used here.
Yes, sir. So in other words, forget the percent, the amount. So they just went in and applied their own perspective that's not related to the law. As she said, it's anywhere from 8 to 24%. She just applied 15% to the entire profit.
So I think that was the trying to portray the markup beyond the amount of costs that were incurred to produce the item.
Okay, let's go back and talk for a second about what's available in the marketplace. There's been discussion about the market value, the marketplace, and then the 2% discount that was applied. Were there others available that someone could have gone to get the same parts that they wanted?
So I'd have to look at each one of those parts, but as I was describing earlier, in those instances where we have a manufacturer or a seller or contractor presenting us a part that is sold in the marketplace, that exact same part, then our policy and our training is to respect the fact that the going price that another commercial customer paid for that is what the market would bear. What's different in most of these circumstances is that same part is not necessarily sold to other commercial customers. They're of a type, meaning there's some variation of that same part. And then it becomes the analysis of what is the difference in the functionality of that part versus the part that's sold in the marketplace.
Okay, so if there's a generally accepted value and you ask for the parts and they gave you a discount, why would someone assume that they're gouging someone as the majority is attempting to claim today? If you go and buy gasoline at the marketplace and you know it's 268 and you know it's 262 and you buy at 265 somewhere in that marketplace, why would you even have an investigation about how much money you made when that's the marketplace?
Well, sir, I think for that analogy for gasoline, it's essentially the same gasoline that all consumers that are purchasing that. In this case, where these are specialized parts that may be of a type.
They are, but my point is that they were well within the norm of what would be paid for, and they still gave a discount. Is that disingenuous to give a discount off that to get the business? If the going price is X and you make it X minus 2%, why do you set yourself up for being accused of gouging the government? This makes no sense to me.
Sir, I would just say that the starting point for the analysis for a contracting officer is to take a look at whatever the contractor is identified as what they're selling in the commercial marketplace. If they're selling us the exact same product, then that contracting officer will look at the sales price that company has got in the commercial marketplace. If it's something different, there's a different analysis that needs to be undertaken.
And then
the gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Kelly, is now recognized.
I think they get my point.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Hull, thank you for your reports on TransDigm's price gouging. Your recent report identifies astounding levels of excess profits. For example, TransDigm sells a part called a plain enclosed seal that is used on the B-22 Osprey aircraft. You should see a picture of it in the room. According to TransDigm's own data, it costs $125 to make the seal, but they charge DOD more than $1,600, which translates to an excess profit of more than 1,000%. I'd like to show a picture of this part and a chart of TransDigm's excess profits. So you should be able to see that. Ms. Hull, would you characterize DOD paying a contractor over 1,000% profit as government waste? Ms. Hull. Ms. Hull. I'll just move on. Mr. Tenaglia, an analysis released last week by the Project on Government Oversight said, quote, nearly 21 million in excess company profits may not sound like a lot in the context of 768 billion defense budget, but those overcharges add up to a lot of waste and undermine the readiness of our force and weapon systems becoming increasingly costly. Do you agree with that analysis?
Well, I certainly agree with the point that the more we pay unnecessarily, the less capability we can deliver. And so it's the responsibility of our contracting officers to negotiate the best price they can, the price that's fair to industry, and it's fair to the taxpayer and the department.
And TransDigm is a sole source contractor for the B-22 Osprey plane encased seal, which means that the Department of Defense had to buy this part from you or go without it. Isn't that correct?
That is my understanding, and perhaps this is one of the parts that would be a good candidate for reverse engineering.
Mr. Howley, do you think it's fair for taxpayers to pay over $1,600 for a part that costs TransDigm $125 to make?
I think there's a set of regulations that defines how you determine the pricing. And the preferred way to do it is to compare it to the comparable commercial price. And I believe this price is discounted to that. I also believe that when the contract was placed, the government has the right to declare a price fair and reasonable or not fair and reasonable. And that has some other name I don't recall. All these contracts were declared fair and reasonable at the time of placement, and they all have commercially comparable pricing.
Well, that's why we're having this hearing. And in my opinion, taxpayers should not be paying significantly overpaying for parts the military needs to keep the planes flying. Ms. Hull, your audit addressed how the DoD can implement administrative reforms, such as reducing the agency's reliance on sole source manufacturers. Can you elaborate on this?
Thank you. The department proposed a couple of legislative reforms in the last cycle. My understanding and hearing today is that they have some plans for additional legislative cycles or proposals for the current legislative cycle. Now, from a sole source environment, the only other options that the department has is to pursue some of those that Mr. Tenaglia outlined, to include reverse engineering. There's a strategic supplier alliance in which DLA is looking to original equipment manufacturers to potentially cancel their licenses with TransDigm and produce the parts directly for the government. So while there are options there currently in play, a more legislative and regulatory reform would be needed to address the systemic issue.
Okay. The gentlelady, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Keller, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney, and thank you to our witnesses for taking time to be with us today. Americans in Pennsylvania and across our country are contending with huge increases in the price of daily necessities, including fuel, gasoline, and groceries. While the record inflation we've seen over the past year plays a large role, broken supply chains only exacerbate transportation issues and lead to higher end costs. It is time to take a closer look at how the Department of Defense handles its contracts and taxpayer funds. So my question is for Ms. Hull. Can you explain the just-in-time or JIT inventory management system?
Mr. Tenaglia or the department may be able to speak to this more robustly because it wasn't as part of our audit. But just-in-time inventory essentially is being able to get the part just when you need it, and forecasting models are also considered in order for that particular concept to work.
Yeah, and I'm just want to make sure that it's the same as what I've experienced in private industry. But if the Department of Defense miscalculates the parts required for a particular program, how does the DoD go about acquiring additional or replacement parts?
Again, that was not a focus of our audit. However, we did highlight opportunities, potential opportunity for DoD to consider coordinating the quantities that they wish to purchase in order to potentially get a discount on pricing from TransDigm.
So what would happen to the price of a replacement item when it needs to be bought via a rapid order fulfillment?
Again, that was not a focus of our audit. However, the department would have to look into whether they could forecast their demand in time to be able to benefit from that. And pricing, of course, would be impacted in some way.
Okay. Sole source contracting is a longstanding issue within the Pentagon. How can Congress better work with the department to remove barriers to entry and alleviate the many problems that come with lack of competition for these contracts?
The department is pursuing reverse engineering. That is an option. Also, again, the strategic supplier alliance, where an original equipment manufacturer would potentially cancel their licensing agreement with TransDigm and produce those parts for the department directly. But again, sole source parts by their nature without competitive market forces are the systemic issue that our report highlights. And without reform, without some legislation, where a contracting officer can receive the information that they need to be able to make a well-informed negotiation with a contractor, you're going to continue to see these results time and time again.
Yeah, and that's really what we need to address. With a variety of accounting methods available and a large number of domestic contractors available, to meet defense needs. I would urge the Department of Defense to analyze its current system to better assist both the warfighter and taxpayer. And with that, I thank you and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is recognized.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman. Thank you for having this really important hearing about transparency and really accountability. Mr. Holy, in 2020 performance recap, TransDigm had reported that the company fired more than 30% of its workforce in response to the reduced demand during the pandemic. Has TransDigm rehired all of the people that they laid off in 2020, yes or no?
Excuse me, I was muted. The answer is no.
Yeah, just keep it unmuted for a while, okay? TransDigm also stated that it was, quote, implementing unpaid furloughs and salary reductions across the organization. So, Mr. Holy, as we sit here today, has TransDigm restored the employees who furloughed or had their salaries cut in 2020, yes or no?
I don't know the answer to that in all cases.
Okay, please send the answer later to the committee.
Yeah, the commercial airline which is the big chunk of our business.
Okay, I'm trying to get to a point. You can explain it in your response. Mr. Holy, in 2020, in response to the pandemic, you gave up about 2% of your total compensation, correct?
I gave up something, I don't remember the percent.
Okay, it's 2%. At the same time, TransDigm reported to the SEC that your total compensation in 2020 was just over $68 million, including dividends and option awards. So while TransDigm was laying off employees and cutting salaries, it was paying you more than $68 million, even when accounting for the measly 2% of your salary that you gave up. So Mr. Holy, are you aware that you received more than compensation than the CEOs of Raytheon, Boeing, and Lockheed Martin combined? Combined, yes or no?
I don't know what their.
Well, my colleague showed you a chart.
I don't know what their compensation is. Can you repeat the
I'm
question?
I'm trying to find where we can get the money that you owe the American people. So I'm trying to get to a point.
Repeat the question to me about compensation, just so I can answer it carefully. About the
basically, do you know that you receive more the compensation than the CEOs combined of Raytheon, Boeing, and Lockheed Martin?
I don't know their compensation.
That's right. Your compensation was so high that TransDigm felt that it had to include a note in a shareholders report that acknowledged the, quote, magnitude of Mr. Holy's reported compensation, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, Mr. Stein, before we go on, Chairwoman, can I submit for the record the compensation charts, please?
Without objection.
Mr. Stein, to you, Dr. Stein, to you. You received about $22 million in total compensation in 2020 after forfeiting about 25% of your salary, correct?
I believe that's correct.
Oh, thank you for your honesty. So to recap, at the time when the American families were and still are struggling with the financial burden of the pandemic, TransDigm paid two executives here today around $90 million, while at the same time laying off, furloughing, cutting the salaries of its other employees. $90 million, I might add, that TransDigm got by screwing over the American people. Sadly, TransDigm is not unique. You just got caught. I know that we're talking about one company, but know that for me, this is the perfect, you all are the perfect poster child of an out of control defense budget that puts the interests of wealthy, well-connected people like yourselves ahead of the best interests of the American people. You are, for my residents, what corporate greed looks like in America. You too and TransDigm must be held accountable and must pay the $20.8 million in excess profits identified by IG. I would recommend that it comes out of your salaries as your last act before you both resign in disgrace. I would also add on and call on the Department of Defense as a whole to ensure that not a single cent of taxpayer money ever goes to a business run by either of these folks again. It is so critically important, and Chairwoman, we need to continue holding these folks accountable, because when we are not holding them accountable, then we have to cut programs and those things that actually attack this virus, protect the families at the forefront. And for all of my colleagues, they may be wearing suits and may be millionaires and wealthy folks, but they can still be scammers of our country. They can still be scamming our folks. I wish you would all treat them the same way you would if somebody was on food assistance and they didn't maybe qualify. Whatever it is, the fact of the matter is we need to hold them accountable equally. It's the same as we would hold anybody coming before our committee, again, that used, their resources and undermining and also, scamming the system to basically make a profit off of all of us. So I thank you and I yield.
Lady yields back. Gentleman from Kansas, Mr. LaTerna is now recognized. The gentleman from Kansas.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. My first question is for Ms. Hull. In the absence of market-driven pricing, the federal government may be left with a take it or leave it pricing approach by sole source manufacturers. Rather than capping profits with arbitrary profit ceilings or potentially bogging down the procurement process with pricing data requests, is there a way to drive down prices organically by improving competition from smaller, non-traditional defense contractors?
There are certainly ways that the department can potentially begin to do that through some of the methods we discussed, like reverse engineering or the strategic supplier alliance. But like the case that we are discussing today, the majority of the parts are sole source. So there isn't another option for the department currently.
No, I appreciate that. Mr. Tenaglia, this committee a few years ago spent a lot of time unpacking defense contractors' role in contributing to the high prices of spare parts, but applicable laws and regulations seem to invite practices that drive up prices for the federal government and for the American taxpayer by extension. Can you explain the rationale behind the Department of Defense's just-in-time inventory management practices?
Well, Congressman, I think, I'm not sure I'd describe our acquisition of all these parts using just in time. Certainly we can provide some additional information from the Defense Logistics Agency about how they manage inventory. But we're talking about as the number of transactions in the sample happen to be the smaller transactions by design. That was what you asked the IG to look at. And I think inherently that's going to drive some of the smaller quantity purchases. If we were to look at some of the larger value transactions, I would expect on the other side of the Truth in Negotiations Act threshold, I would expect the exception, commercial item exception would most likely come into play, and we would not be getting certified cost and pricing data, but you would have larger transactions with perhaps larger quantities.
I appreciate that. Are you concerned that legislative changes that force companies to disclose cost data will hamstring the DoD's ability to move quickly when procuring spare parts, particularly with just-in-time purchasing?
So I don't want to leave the impression that our contracting officers are always going to need to look at cost data. We have in the law a preference that puts that as the last resort. I'll leave it to the Congress if they want to maintain that, but you can see how that preference plays out. But the current law that we have that asks us to look at analogous pricing, starting with sales data, I come back to the point I was making earlier. The starting point is really analyzing the particular part that you're buying and asking yourself and the market, doing the market research to demonstrate whether that same product is sold in the commercial marketplace. If it is, then we will look at what other consumers are paying for that product. But it's almost never quite that straightforward because it's usually an of a type commercial product, and then we need to make do some analysis on the differences between the product that's sold in the commercial marketplace and the product that we're buying.
Thank you. Appreciate you being here today, as well as the other conferees. Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Woman yields back. The gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Bush, is now recognized for 5 minutes. We lost her. Unmute Corey Bush.
Thank you. And thank you, Madam Chair, for convening this hearing. St. Louis and I are very troubled to hear about yet more military waste from the IG audit. TransDigm sells a linear actuating cap, which is used in both the Eagle F-15 and Stratolifter C-135 airplanes. According to the IG report, TransDigm sold this part to DoD for $7,495 per spare part, despite it only costing TransDigm $189 to make the part. The price has increased by 400% in just the last 3 decades and doubled in just a 3-year period. Mr. Tenaglia, why would DoD pay double what it paid for the same spare part just 3 years prior?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Part of our analysis is looking at what we've previously paid. Ideally, we're looking at what other competitive consumers are paying in the marketplace. For this particular item, and I don't know if the exact same item is sold in the commercial marketplace. I suspect it is not. And then the reality becomes whether this is a flight safety item, the leverage that we have. We need the part as a sole source supplier. If there's no other source to buy that part, we're going to need to make the purchase to keep our aircraft flying.
Yes, and so $189 to make, but $7,400 is what is being paid for this. The IG audit determined that TransDigm's excess profit for this part was over 3,800%. Just to be clear, that is not the profit TransDigm earned. Mr. Stein, how can TransDigm justify, though? How can you justify charging $7,000 for a part that just costs $189?
I'm glad you asked that question. It's a great question. There's a commercial equivalent for that part. The commercial equivalent costs $8,182. We gave the DoD a 10% discount on that part. And over 5 years, the DoD ordered less than 40 pieces. Over 5 years, 40 parts. It's so small and irregular. And we gave a discount of 10% to commercial. It's simple to explain. I don't understand why we're here even. We're giving a discount to commercial prices.
You're giving a discount on something that costs $189 to make. Mr. Stein, will you commit to paying back the excess profit TransDigm received in this example, as well as the other 105 parts identified by the IG as returning excess profit? Yes or no?
It's not a yes or no answer.
Yes or no? Because what we're talking about here is something that's $189 to make, not necessarily what somebody else is charging for it. It's $189
we
to
look
make.
Forward to working with the DoD.
Reclaiming
Okay.
my time.
Okay.
It's essential that TransDigm pay back the $20.8 million it made in excess profits as a result of this price gouging. As lawmakers, we will also work to ensure that this abuse ends. Recouping those excess profits is the difference between having housing or not, mapping environmental racism or not, having clean drinking water or not. $20.8 million could fund housing for tens of thousands of our veterans, many of whom are far too often living on the street. And I know because I'm out there working with them. It could map environmental racism in hundreds of communities like St. Louis that are suffering from polluted air and climate change. It could provide millions of gallons of clean drinking water for children and families, especially Black and brown families all across this country. Instead, more than 50% of the exorbitant $778 billion defense budget is given to military contractors. Ms. Hull, would you say that the linear actuating cap represents an isolated case of DoD waste and mismanagement of money?
The part that you mentioned was the highest excess profit percentage that we found during the audit. But the profit percentages ranged anywhere from 2.8% to 3,850.6%.
Despite receiving hundreds of billions of dollars every year, the DoD has never detailed its assets or undergone a complete clean audit, likely leading to the kinds of abuse and waste we're discussing in today's hearing. I'm encouraged by the steps this committee is taking to address this pressing issue. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Fallon, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate it. I have Mr. Tenaglia. Obviously, there's got to be a balance between the needs of our warfighters and the needs of our taxpayers. And the longer that R&D takes and the longer acquisition takes, it's worse for both. That's money and time that's wasted, and in a hot war, it could mean even more. In your opinion, is it acceptable that the DoD is consistently overpaying on contracts?
Well, it's never acceptable if we're paying excessive prices. In this case, we're talking about whether or not our contracting officers should have full access to the information, the part we just described, or any of the other parts for that matter, whether we know all the facts that really would go into that. If we were in the world, non-commercial items, and again, most of these items are probably commercial. I don't know, you'd have to do a part-by-part analysis. But in the world of non-commercial items, the way we put ourselves on level footing is the legislation that the Congress enacted many years ago, the Truth in Negotiation Act, which gives us access to the information and furthermore requires companies to certify that all the facts that they're revealing to us for the purpose of negotiation are current, accurate, and complete. That doesn't come into play here for two reasons. One, because we're below the dollar threshold for these transactions, and two, because they're commercial. But what we really need is a policy that'll give our contracting officers a means to establish fair and reasonable pricing when some of the TINA exceptions are in play.
Back your time. Fallon, are you finished? Mr. Fallon, we seem to have lost Mr. Fallon. Let's go on and we can come back to him. Mr. Fallon? Let's go to Mr. Clyde. Mr. Clyde, you're now recognized. We seem to have lost Mr. Fallon.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ranking Member Comer for holding this hearing today. While I appreciate a closer examination of wasteful government spending, I cannot help but notice that we need to take a closer look at the flaws in the Department of Defense's acquisition process too, including what I call just-in-time inventory and what the industry calls that as well. Time and time again, the Department of Defense has had difficulty correctly forecasting much needed, highly sophisticated spare parts until it comes time for repairs, thus leading, in my opinion, to costly small batch ordering. This issue has gone on for years. In fact, in March of 1986, the GAO produced a report called DoD Initiatives to Improve the Acquisition of Spare Parts. This report highlighted that the Department of Defense continuously purchased spare parts at high prices when less expensive alternatives were available. To further highlight the Department of Defense's flawed acquisition, in a 2015 report, the Inspector General of the Department of Defense stated that in 20 of 32 reports regarding spare part price issues since 1998, it was found that the Department of Defense did not perform adequate cost or price analysis when purchasing spare parts. That leads me to question, as a Navy supply officer for over 2 decades, I've had a fair bit of experience when it comes to Department of Defense procurement. So that leads me to question, why are we holding these hearings on TransDigm's profits when we should be primarily focusing, in my opinion, on the Department of Defense's acquisition processes? So, Mr. Tenaglia, a question for you. Thank you for being here today. I appreciate that. Regarding item procurements, what research is done to ensure that the Department of Defense is getting the best price available, sir?
Well, for the items we're talking about in this IG sample, for the most part, it's a universe of parts that are known to the Defense Logistics Agency. There are parts that we've procured in the past. There may be some market research to identify not only alternative sources, but alternative parts. But for most cases in the sustainment environment, I think the parts that we're talking about, there aren't alternatives. And the question is, what can we do to create alternative sourcing where we do have sole source suppliers such as TransDigm?
Right. Okay. All right. So once you've determined what the best available price is, are there things that prevent you from placing larger batch orders that would give you maybe a better price because of the increase in quantity?
In my discussions with the senior officials at Defense Logistics Agency, they recognize that that is a factor. And they describe a scenario where they are responding to a demand signal from the military departments that have needs for a particular part. Perhaps the department in general could have done a better job at predicting when they would need that. But all those factors that go into that, I think we owe you a more robust answer that goes into the inventory management. And I'm not really the subject matter expert to address that, but that is certainly a factor in the price we pay. The smaller the quantities,
right.
by virtue of this particular sample, the IG was asked to only look at the smaller dollar purchases. So inherently, you're going to have the smaller batches. And so there's another universe of larger procurements with larger quantities that really weren't examined for this particular audit.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I would think that for highly sophisticated equipment intended for national security use, I would think that we would generally want a little more depth when it comes to our inventory positions. When things like aircraft or whatever, that was my primary focus as an aviation supply officer. So as a follow-up, based on your experience, what information or resources do you think DoD could use to improve forecasting and inventory management? Or are there any that come to mind right now?
Congressman, I actually prefer to take that one for the record. That's not my area of expertise.
Okay.
But
all right.
We can get back to you with a fulsome answer.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We'll now go to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson. You're now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this very important hearing. And I have missed much of it, having to attend two other hearings. But I'm happy to be here right now. And I may ask a question that's been already asked and answered. And I've told you why that may happen. So I apologize for it. But Mr. Stein, in your response to the OIG report, your company stated that after working with DoD officials, quote, there have been improvements to the procurement process, end quote. What specific improvements were made?
It's a great question. Thanks for asking. We have formed a working group with the DoD DLA to look at pricing and procurement issues that may exist in any of our businesses. This is something we've put in place. We have hired outside consultants, experts. We've retrained our people as we do constantly on this topic. We've also now gone the further step of submitting commerciality packages upfront on every part that has a commercial equivalent. So we take that off the table, and we now offer discounts, volume discounts, if they buy more than what they're asking for. Unfortunately, to date,
I'm sorry for interrupting.
No. Sorry.
Let me ask you this question. What has the company done specifically to ensure that it never overcharges the government by a 3,850.6% profit margin on a particular product?
Well, as I've said earlier, we disagree with that. This calculation omits the taxes and interest we paid to the federal government, the taxes. I don't think that percentage is any justification.
How much taxes did the company pay?
What the amount we were obligated to pay legally. I don't actually know the answer to that.
Well, but you're saying your tax burden would substantially cut into a...
Well, for these contracts, the taxes and interest were $10 million. So it's half of the overcharge. Half of it that is being alleged is taxes and interest that the IG somehow correlated as profit. This makes no sense.
Well, it makes no sense that we would have a figure of 3,850% profit margin off of one product, which is kind of like a business model that you have for your company to go in and purchase companies that manufacture parts, and then getting a lock on the market so that there is no place other than your company for the government to purchase a part. And then you turn around and charge the government whatever, or charge the taxpayers, actually, whatever you feel like you want to charge them. And it can be as high as 3,850%. I think that is despicable conduct. This is the second time that this committee has held a hearing to address your company's price gouging on essential military parts. The last hearing that we held resulted in your company refunding $16.1 million requested by the Department of Defense. Do you see your company paying back the $20 million that DOD has asked you to pay back as a result of overcharging the government?
You know, as I've said repeatedly, we see significant accounting and legal errors in this IG report. We look forward to sitting down directly with the DOD. And I will tell you, Congressman, that if we find that TransDigm made a mistake in any of our contracting, we will gladly pay money back. But what we must do is agree to the facts. The facts are that we lost money on 9 of the contracts. We only made 37% average on this entire IG audited parts. And we now know definitively that we gave the DOD and the American warfighter a 25% discount to commercial prices. I don't understand why we would pay back of $21 million when, as we've illustrated, there are so many, it's rife with error.
The gentleman's time has expired, and we are now going to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer. You are now recognized.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm fascinated by listening to some of your socialist members talk about how the private sector should operate and what an appropriate profit level is, and all of the points they've made. But Ms. Hull, I want to talk a little bit about the methodology in your report, and just yes or no to these questions, please. First, the decision to make anything more than 15% profit excessive. In your report, you state that a 15% cap did not apply by law or regulation to any of the contracts examined. Is that correct?
It is not defined as a specific 15% benchmark by law, no.
Correct. Yes. So you also state that a 15% cap should not be the benchmark for negotiating firm fixed price contracts. Is that correct?
Correct. It is not a standard.
Right. Finally, you state that a 15% cap is not the formal position of the Inspector General, and this report should not be interpreted to mean that. Is that correct?
Correct, but if I could add, we were asked to determine the fair and reasonable prices for these parts requested by the committee. And in order to do that, we had to calculate a benchmark. So that is where that 15% was applied.
Next, the decision to exclude taxes and interest, as Congressman Norman pointed out. In your report, you state that you determined to not allow taxes and interest in your cost calculations. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You also state that the exclusion of taxes and interest from your calculations should not be interpreted to mean that offerers cannot include these costs in their negotiations. Is that correct?
Yes, but if I could add, again, we were asked to determine a fair and reasonable price, and because we received cost data, FAR 31 allowed us to look at it from that perspective, which is why we removed interest and taxes as allowable costs.
Right. So you use 2 standards in this report that you yourself admit you would not advocate for. Mr. Stein, the IG report highlights a few spare parts manufactured by TransDigm that had multiple contracts in one calendar year for a very low dollar amount. I have a few questions, and again, just a yes or no, because I've got 2 minutes and 40 seconds left. Does the DOD investigate? No, I'm sorry. Does DOD instigate those negotiations? Meaning it is DOD who comes to you and says what they need to order, correct?
That is correct.
Does DOD determine how many of each part they need?
Yes.
Does DOD determine when they request the parts?
Yes.
Does this haphazard kind of contracting put you in a more difficult position?
Absolutely. It's not regular purchases or there's no forecast to it. What comes is what I need immediately today.
So generally, would purchasing more parts at once and in a more regular manner drive down cost?
Yes, it will drive down price and it will drive down cost. And we've offered these to the government, to the DOD, and they've not taken us up on a single offer to lower the price to buy more parts.
And I think that's what this hearing should be about. And my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle have pointed that out. I just want to clarify a few other things in closing here. How much of your business is direct to government?
6% is direct.
6%. 6% is all that you sell to the government. That's what your government sales are.
Yes, direct government sales, 6%.
What is the average price the government pays versus the commercial sector?
I don't, on this basket of contracts, 25% lower.
25% lower. Mr. Tenaglia, based on those answers, it would appear the DOD has an issue with demand forecasting. Finally, yes or no, did DOD agree to and sign all the contracts that were analyzed by the IG?
Yes, it's my understanding they did.
I believe, and look, we're passionate about waste, fraud, and abuse in the Department of Defense, but I believe we have to look at the Department of Defense for a lot of the problems that are being discussed in this hearing today. There's a better way to order parts. We've talked about that in this committee hearing over the 5 years that I've served on this committee. So hopefully that's something that the DOD can focus on in the future to be more efficient and to be a better advocate of tax dollars. So, Madam Chair, my time has expired and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and we will now hear from the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. And I understand Mr. Fallon is back, and we will go back to him. I now recognize Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses who are here today. And, I'd like to just jump straight into it. Mr. Howley, thank you as well for being here. I just want to start off with a simple question. The spare parts that TransDigm supplied to the U.S. military were used in Afghanistan, correct? Mr. Howley?
Excuse me, I was muted. I don't know the answer, but I would presume probably.
Well, TransDigm has supplied the U.S. military with spare parts for aircraft, such as the AH-64 Apache, the C-17 Globemaster III, the F-16 Fighting Falcon, and the CH-47 Chinook, correct?
I believe so. I don't know that whole list, but
well, each of those aircraft were used in Afghanistan. Now, TransDigm is the sole supplier for many of the spare parts that the Pentagon needs for these aircrafts. In other words, there is no question that the spare parts that TransDigm supplied to the U.S. military were used in Afghanistan. So, Mr. Howley, it does seem like the war in Afghanistan was a boon for TransDigm, correct?
I don't know the answer to that.
You don't know. Well, I have some numbers here to give us an idea. According to the Wall Street Journal, since 2001, military outsourcing has pushed Pentagon spending to about $14 trillion. That's 12 zeros. And to give a comparison, even after averaging out that number over 20 years, that's at least 12 times the amount that we spend on an essential program like SNAP. And in essence, really, the United States and the U.S. government hid the real price tag of our war in Afghanistan in contracts with private companies like yours. According to Ms. Heidi Peltier at Brown University's Costs of War program, the U.S. military's reliance on contractors has led to the rise in a camo economy, in which the U.S. government camouflages the costs of war that might reduce public support for it. So $14 trillion were handed over to private industry, companies like TransDigm, but also Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Boeing, without real transparency with the American public. So, Mr. Howley, was there a net negative to TransDigm's bottom line, or has it been a net negative to TransDigm's bottom line that the war in Afghanistan has ended?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know where the total defense spending has gone. I think it's probably still stayed about flat. I just don't know the answer.
Okay, so as the executive chairman of TransDigm, you're not sure about the financial impact of military contracting with respect to Afghanistan with your company, despite the fact that it was one of the sole suppliers of many of the military supplies and contracts that they were using?
No, what I said is I am not sure specifically what the impact of the cessation of the fighting in Afghanistan was on the total buys that we got from the government. I just don't know how to parse that out.
And you don't have like a general idea, even if it's not a specific number.
I think that our defense business has been roughly flat, I believe, but I don't know the exact number.
Okay. Mr. Howley, what was your compensation in 2020?
It's a public number, so you probably have it. I'm not looking at it. I think it was 68 million or thereabouts.
Mr. Stein, what was your compensation in 2020?
I think you have it. It was somewhere around 20 million.
Okay. And TransDigm, it does seem that in 2020, TransDigm did lay off its employees during this time as well. The company fired about 30% of its workforce in order to maintain a revenue stream. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe those numbers are accurate.
And even while the government paid TransDigm $1.5 billion in cash as part of a pandemic debt buyback program to prevent precisely those layoffs from occurring, you took home a total of $90 million in compensation during that time, more than the compensation of chief executives of Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Raytheon combined. So let's talk about what contributed exactly to such exorbitant compensation. Now, TransDigm sells a part called a linear actuating cap. It's used in the Eagle F-15 and the Stratolifter C-135. It costs the company only $135 to produce. Now, Mr. Stein, how much did TransDigm charge the Pentagon for this $135 part?
About 10% less than what we charged the commercial world for this part.
Do you know how much that was?
About 10% less, yeah.
So about $7,495.
Yes, and the commercial part is $8,182.
And that's a profit margin about 3,850%.
No, that's not how you...
The gentlelady's time has expired. He can respond in writing to our question. Mr. Fallon, you're now recognized for your 2 remaining minutes that, and we seem to have lost you during this process. Welcome back. We now
Madam Chair, thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Mr. Tenaglia, has the DoD acquired any IP from sole source contracts?
Generally, that's not what we do. What we try to do in some limited circumstances is produce intellectual property using our own engineers and sending out technical data packages for reprocurement through reverse engineering. But it's not generally our practice to buy back the intellectual property from sole source providers.
So do we, how often do we purchase any IP at all?
Well, so that's for the items we're talking about in this spare part universe. All the decisions about intellectual property were made long ago, and so now we're living with some of those decisions. In many cases, it makes the most sense for the department to allow companies to retain their intellectual property. Sometimes that results in putting us in less than the best position with respect to competition, but that's a trade-off we make. It would be very expensive for the department to buy up all the intellectual property, and I'm not sure industry would generally be interested in selling us all their intellectual property.
But yeah, because I was going to follow up with, do you think this is cost effective to do it that way?
Well, I think to the extent that we can do whatever we can to maintain competition for our weapon systems and spare parts, that will put us in the best position to get the best price.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Harrell, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I had some problems with my other computer. Just kind of following along just the discussion in terms of procurement. I'm directing this question to Ms. Hull. In October, members of the House Appropriations Committee requested that this committee conduct an independent review of the evidence used to support the Department of Defense Inspector General's April 2020 report on the Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure, JEDI, cloud procurement. Since then, I have received extensive briefings on this matter. New evidence obtained through the FOIA raises serious questions about criminal violations in connection with the JEDI procurement. Thus, I have asked to meet with the Acting Inspector General, Sean O'Donnell, over the oversight investigation and the evidence collected to support the April 2020 JEDI report. I hope this meeting can be arranged with the IG soon. As members of Congress, it is without question our right to review documents referenced publicly and cited repeatedly in the JEDI report without extensive redactions. And as members of this committee, especially in our oversight capacity, we must review the actual evidence underlying the conclusions in the JEDI report. It is critical that Congress have trust and confidence in the integrity of the procurement process and the Office of the Inspector General, and I intend to do everything to see that this happens. Ms. Hull, will you commit that the IG will meet with me and any other member of this committee?
While I did not personally work on the JEDI product that you mentioned, I will certainly take that question back.
Thank you. Would very much appreciate it. And Madam Chair, I hope that this committee will proceed with an investigation on this important matter. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. And before I close, I'd like to offer the ranking member an opportunity to give a closing remarks if he would so wish. Mr. Comer, you are now recognized.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be very brief. We've got a lot of problems in America. We've got a lot of problems with reckless, unnecessary spending. If we want to focus on the Department of Defense now and look at a big ticket item of waste, we should be holding hearings on exactly how much military equipment was left behind in the debacle withdrawal that President Biden orchestrated in Afghanistan. This is something that I get asked every day in my congressional district. And unfortunately, we don't know the answer. And I think that's, you're talking billions and billions of dollars. That's what we need to be focused on. So what we've learned from this committee hearing today is the same thing we learned 2 or 3 years ago when we had this same hearing. The Department of Defense needs to do a better job in establishing an inventory and in establishing how they purchase parts. We've heard that in other committee hearings as well. So I would like to see some type of plan moving forward from the Department of Defense. There's no question there's a lot of wasteful spending at the Pentagon. And it's our duty on the Oversight Committee to try to reduce waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government. But I don't think this committee hearing picking on this one private sector company, the trying to build this, I think the members on your side of the aisle, Madam Chair, trying to build this is a government contracting company. 6% of their sales goes to the federal government. And the other 94% are commercial. And they said they sell their parts to the government at 25% discount to what they sell it in the commercial market to the commercial airlines and companies like that. So, yeah, I think we can spend our time better looking at the bigger ticket items and trying to bring the Pentagon in, the Department of Defense officials in, to see if there's a better way, if we can help facilitate that, a better way to do business at the Department of Defense. Again, Madam Chair, thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman, for his testimony and for co-chairing this with me. And I would now like to thank our witnesses for testifying today, Mr. Howley, Mr. Stein. Thank you for agreeing to testify. Mr. Tenaglia and Ms. Hull, thank you for your service to our country. Ms. Hull, I'd like to thank you in particular for your continued work to hold TransDigm accountable and root out waste, fraud, and abuse in the Department of Defense. We heard today that TransDigm is fleecing taxpayers by refusing to provide cost data, which forces contracting officers to accept TransDigm's prices in order to secure the parts our military desperately needs. TransDigm's debate over the 15% benchmark is a deflection tactic. TransDigm, in some cases, received over 1,000% profit. So whether the benchmark is 15, 20, or even 50%, TransDigm received outrageously excessive profits. In regards to the IG's exclusion of tax and interest, they did so in accordance with federal cost principles. The IG report explains that TransDigm is highly leveraged, leading to high interest payments on debt. Americans should not have to be footing the bill for TransDigm's acquisition strategy. Mr. Howley and Mr. Stein also discussed giving the Department of Defense a discount from the price it sells to commercial airlines. Regardless of whether the Defense Department received its discount, it does not change the fact that the inflated prices still resulted in excess profits of over 1,000% in multiple instances. I strongly urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support reforms that would empower contracting officers and require companies like TransDigm to provide cost information when it is necessary to determine the proposed the proposed prices are unfair and unreasonable. Mr. Howley and Mr. Stein, we've heard from many committee members. We expect TransDigm to pay back the outrageous excess profits, all to $20.8 million should be repaid. It received this money at the expense of our warfighters and American taxpayers. We expect you to repay this money to the taxpayers. Now, in closing, I want to thank our panelists for their remarks, all of them, and I want to commend my colleagues for participating in this important conversation. Before we adjourn, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit into the record a statement from the Project on Government Oversight. Without objection, so ordered. With that, without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous material and to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as they are able. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.